I would now like to go ahead and introduce our speakers, Catherine Umanek and Molly Adler. So Catherine Umanek, LCSW, is a licensed clinical social worker who works primarily with people with emotion dysregulation, especially those with BPD and or addiction. She runs the Instagram and Facebook accounts, Catherine LCSW, where she makes research-based posts about BPD to fight stigma and improve access to non-judgmental information about the diagnosis. Molly Adler is the producer and host of the Back from the Borderline podcast. Since its launch in 2021, Back from the Borderline has skyrocketed up the podcasting charts, having landed in the top 1% most downloaded on Apple Podcasts and the top 1% most followed on Spotify. After discovering that she identified with the traits of BPD, Molly began sharing her journey toward healing and recovery in front of a podcast microphone, not knowing if anyone would listen. As her audience quickly grew, and after listening to and reading hundreds of voicemails and emails from listeners who shared similar feelings and experiences, she began to question the validity and helpfulness of psychiatric disorder labels entirely. What started as a podcast about BPD and EUPD has become a rallying cry and sanctuary for anyone suffering from the harm of disorder or dysfunction labels, seeking a more holistic approach to healing from trauma and psychological suffering. Through her passion for depth, psychology, philosophy, myth, and mysticism, Molly aims to connect with and provide peer support to listeners who she believes are not disordered, but spiritually starved and emotionally congested. Thank you, Catherine and Molly, and I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Paula and Jillian and everybody for that amazing introduction. I'll speak for Molly. We're so happy to be here. This is such an honor to be invited. And thank you so much to everybody who worked behind the scenes to put all of that together, because it was no small feat, the behind the scenes work. So we are going to talk today a little bit about using social media to break boundaries. It looks like some of you in the comments know who we are, and that is so flattering. But for those of you who might not, I'm Catherine Humanek. Like Sarah said, I run the Catherine LCSW Instagram and Facebook pages. I also post about BPD on LinkedIn. And I kind of fell into social media by accident. So when I started my private practice as a therapist, I was told if you want clients under the age of 40, you have to have some kind of social media presence. You don't have to do anything super fancy, but people are going to look you up. They want to make sure you exist. They want to get a sense of, who you are. So having social media can help with that. So I made a social media account, and I was just kind of posting general mental health things, like inspirational messages, stuff like that. Never got any traction for about almost 2 years. And then I made a post specifically about BPD. And there was such a hunger for that information. The post about BPD just took off. And all of a sudden, I had never gotten more than 100 likes on any post ever in my life. And all of a sudden, I had 1,000 on this post about BPD. And I said, huh. And it was funny because I work with people with BPD in my private practice. That's actually why I became a therapist, but I had never thought about using social media as an educational tool. But after the response I got on that post, it was clear that people want that information. There are people out there who want educational information about mental health delivered through social media. So I started making more and more posts. I started doing more and more research for these posts. And I thought I knew a lot about BPD, but honestly, social media has made me a better therapist, because I do probably an hour or 90 minutes behind the scene of research on every post I make. And that's information that I get to share with the world. And it's also information that I get to share with my clients. So that's kind of how I ended up over here in the social media world, kind of by accident. But I'm so glad to be here, and this has just become something so beyond my wildest dreams. So I'm going to hand it back over to Molly, if you're there, and she can tell you a little bit the podcasts.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. And I also just want to thank the Emotions Matter team and also the sponsors who've come together to make this event possible. And also, I just want to thank all of you who showed up here today, because if you're here, it likely means that you identify with the traits of BPD or you love someone who does. And I am not a licensed clinician. I'm someone who identifies with the traits of BPD and who, in my search for something relatable to listen to, I've been a podcast fan myself since 2014. So it was very early days in podcasting. And I always listened to podcasts, and having a background in audio and songwriting myself, I always thought it would be so cool to have a podcast, but what would I ever talk about? So I maintained being a super fan of podcasts until some personal rock bottom moments led me to my aha, I am the problem moment I talk about on my podcast a lot. And there's a difference between the I am the problem moment where you feel like something's wrong with you. It was more like, okay, I was awakened to these behaviors and repetitive loops that I was reenacting due to my childhood trauma. And I decided that I have control. I can save myself. And I wanted to find out what it would feel like to try rewriting some of this faulty programming that I experienced and started mimicking when I was young. And so I tried finding some podcasts that I could relate to in terms of BPD traits, and I couldn't quite find anything that I resonated with. And I thought, why not start my own podcast? Maybe this is my thing that I can talk about. And so that took me on a journey to start speaking. And throughout my journey, I've had my podcast for just a little over 2 years now. The way that I've come to view psychological suffering has changed quite a lot. I am trying my best to move away from pathologizing the human experience and more towards really feeling my emotions and realizing that these traits weren't something wrong with me. They were things that I started doing as a child that were adaptive to keep me safe. And now as an adult, they're no longer adaptive for me. And in my podcast, I just openly share my own journey and what I come across as I go, and try my best to remind my listeners that these are things that have helped me. I always give thoughts and advice from a lived experience perspective, but I'm so of the belief that everyone has their own personal recovery journey. And for me, to tie it back into the theme, that's what it means for me with breaking boundaries. And when it comes to social media, I believe in sharing little bits on social media in order to get some listeners to come over to the long form content side of what I do, because I believe that long form content has a really beautiful place in recovery, because in areas like long form content, especially with podcasting, it's very intimate. You're in the ears of your listeners, and it allows for a safer space to discuss nuanced topics rather than so much of the very black and white and polarized nature of social media. So I try my best to find listeners through social media, but get them to come and sit with me in a long form audio format. And it's been wonderfully healing for me. I've heard from my listeners that it's been healing for them. And it just has been such a powerful recovery tool for myself of having a purpose. And just a couple of months ago, I was able to resign from my full-time job in order to be able to podcast full time. And so I'm so honored to be here, and I'm excited to continue having this discussion about breaking boundaries and social media with Catherine and the rest of you.
So one of the things that I was thinking as you were sharing about the long form is, one of the perks of being on the internet, right, being chronically online, is that there is information available however you like it to be delivered. So Molly and I always joke, because Molly and I know each other outside of the internet. And we always joke, I don't actually like podcasts. I can't listen to long audio and pay attention to it. I need something in front of my face. And that's great because, people who need podcasts, they're not going to find as much benefit from a short form written provide. They want the podcast. People who are like me and maybe have auditory processing issues, or it's just a lot to sit and listen, they like the short form and being able to scroll through, or here's a little tidbit of information. And that's really one of my favorite things about this is, I think my fear when I first started being a little bit more visible online was, I can't possibly be everything to everyone. And that's hard. It does weigh on me. And it's also such a pleasure to know that I don't have to be, because there are people like Molly and people like the other presenters that are going to be on today who make that new information available in so many different ways. So however you prefer to get your information, it's there.
Absolutely. I agree. I'm like, what do we talk about now? What you're witnessing is just real people being real people. I mean, to piggyback off what Catherine is saying, I think Catherine and I have had a couple of conversations in between this plenary, and we were just asking, how do we feel about social media? And for me, I think that something really important to discuss too is like the algorithm. A lot of times, like when I was first interacting with social media, when it came to being in a really rocky emotional place, I think it can be tempting to spend a lot of time on social media. And it can also be tempting to say, oh, the algorithm is showing me all of these depressing things. And something that's really helped me in my recovery is it's actually not the algorithm that is doing this to us. It's what you engage in. And I really believe when it comes to breaking boundaries on social media, when it comes to empowering yourself to have a better experience on these types of platforms, whether that be podcasts or YouTube videos or TikToks, it's maybe try your best to prune your social media presence like a garden, right? Sometimes you need to take out the weeds. You need to go through and unfollow or mute accounts that maybe are not the best for your mental health. You should go actively seek out accounts like Catherine's, for example, and many other participants on this that are joining, on the volunteers that are speaking, people that speak out from a space of maybe just being 10 steps ahead of you in their recovery journey, where it can help you feel like there's a light at the end of the tunnel, rather than getting caught in kind of this like well of incredibly profound content, because the suffering is very real. But it's like, do you want to surround yourself with that topic all day long? Because it will have an impact on your psyche. And I remember when I was at my lowest point, when I was just listening to sad music, following a million of sad meme accounts, and it's just like I could really feel my entire energy being drugged down by that. And so ever since I've started my recovery journey in earnest, I'm so particular about, even if I see something, I try, even if I relate to it, it's kind of like a downer that I know it could trigger me, I try not even to double tap stuff like that, because I know that it's going to train my algorithm. So I'm constantly having a conscious relationship with these algorithms and knowing that I'm in charge of what I see. What do you think about that, Catherine?
Yeah, I think people underestimate how much like the internet knows about you, if that makes sense. I remember my husband was scrolling through and he kept getting like a certain kind of video. And he was like, why do I keep getting this video? I'm not liking it. Well, he was watching it. He was watching it all the way through, and he wasn't clicking on it, but he was watching it. And he didn't know that it actually tracks how long you look at something. Mm-hmm. But really, I mean, I believe knowledge is power, right? So if you know that, that is something that you can use for your benefit. And I personally, I'm a believer in having like a Finsta, like having multiple Instagrams. I even encourage some of my clients when we're talking about like ways to distract yourself when you're in crisis. I say, make a separate TikTok and tell that account that all you look at is cats, llamas, nature pictures, like, and that's all you should engage with on that account. And then when you need a positive distraction, you can still use social media, right? Because I think it's easy to say people shouldn't be using social media. And technically, for like the health of your brain, the less time you spend on your phone, probably the better. Yeah. However, let's live in reality. People are using their phones. Let's help them kind of hack how they can use social media to help them. And to your point, I do think there is some content out there that it might really emotionally resonate. And there's certainly nothing wrong with engaging with that content, but just to be aware that it will continue to show you more like that.
Yeah.
So that's something that I'm really, really glad that I'm on Instagram, is because what the algorithm also does is it says, well, if you like stuff like this, you might also like this educational account, because a lot of people who like this educational account.
Mm-hmm.
And I also know that, I always say Instagram isn't therapy, because it's true, it's not therapy, but I understand that therapy is not widely accessible, especially therapy for BPD. That's just the reality of the situation, unfortunately. And there are so many more resources outside of therapy than there used to be. And social media is one of them if you use it right. Social media can't cure you from any kind of mental or physical illness by any means, but you can connect with people who are going through what you're doing, see what worked for those people, see what you can adapt. You have access to, there's online DBT skills and all these sorts of things that are all available and all have touch points in social media. So even if traditional therapy or DBT therapy is not accessible, if there's wait lists, if they don't have it in your area, if it's financially prohibitive, whatever it may be, there are so many more options. You've got Dr. Fox on YouTube. You've got so many more workbooks. You've got, suddenly everyone else who's on Instagram has emptied out of my mind, and I feel terrible, but there's so many sources of hopeful information. There's so many sources of helpful information available. And even though social media isn't perfect, if we lean into that, so much good can come of it.
I couldn't agree more. Someone put in the chat, the Buddha calls curating, sorry, it went down. The Buddha calls, okay, every time someone puts a comment, the Buddha calls curating our social media input, guarding our sense doors. And I really love that. And it made me think of something that I think it's really easy when we're in crisis point to think that when we're identifying with BPD traits, at least this is what I did, let me go on and just follow every single BPD account that possibly exists, right? And when you do that, again, it's sending a message to your algorithm that the only thing you want to see is BPD stuff. And while it's great, it can also make you think like this is all of life, right? And there are just so many other things that I've found in my journey. Do I follow a few BPD accounts? Absolutely. But what I've also found really helpful is philosophy, for example. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Stoic philosophy, but I think it's a great thing for people that struggle with emotion dysregulation in general. And it's something that I never even clicked that could be a resource. And someone here shared, a bit of Buddhist philosophy, for example. And there is an element of Buddhism and Taoism, which are thoughts from the East that are very philosophical and not necessarily what you would think of as religious. And if you're not familiar with this, Marsha Linehan, the creator of DBT, was also a Zen master. So a lot of Buddhist philosophy and these things crept into DBT, which has turned out to be a powerful healing modality for people who identify with these traits. So I guess what I'm trying to say is know that there are other types of resources that can help you. For me, that has been Stoic philosophy and other types of philosophy. It's helped me really develop my critical thinking skills, which is something that I think for myself and my listeners, really having that what's called dichotomous thinking or splitting or black and white thinking is something that it makes it more difficult for us to be in the world. When we develop our critical thinking skills and see the shades of gray and the different options available to us at all times, this can be powerful in our recovery journey. And there are other ways to get these skills that aren't just BPD accounts or DBT accounts. And I just wanted to share that in case it could help anyone else.
Yeah. And I think that's something that, again, I'm a therapist, so I have to say go to therapy. But again, that is not an option for everybody. And I do understand that. And I think one of the most amazing things about being on social media is you can share what worked for you as Stoic philosophy. And if that clicks for somebody, that's a jumping off point for them. They can go explore that. They might not have even known that existed, or Buddhist philosophy. Or for me, I learned mindfulness in yoga. I didn't know anything about DBT. I just knew I was a hot mess, and I felt better when I went to yoga. And the more yoga I did, I felt even better. And the more control I had over my emotions, the more I could watch my thoughts come and go. And then I found out about DBT, and I saw the mindfulness module, and I was like, that looks super familiar. But it's again, right? It's the general concepts of recovery are fairly constant, right? Mm-hmm. Learning ways to kind of surf your emotions as they come up and down, learning skills to make the ups and downs a little bit less extreme. We're always going to be people. Life is always going to be like this, but it doesn't have to be like this, right? Learning the distress tolerance skills, learning interpersonal stuff, like those are the DBT modules, but those concepts are available in so many different ways. And when people share their personal stories on social media, they are kind of showing people what worked for them. It doesn't have to work for everybody, but if 2% of people who see that, that's what changes the trajectory of their recovery, it's more than worth it. So I think there's, to Molly's point, there are so many avenues to recovery, and social media just shows us ones we didn't even think about, we wouldn't have been aware of.
Absolutely. And I saw Melanie type in the thing of individual healing. And I love when Melanie says that, because someone made a comment that their nephew had gotten into Stoicism, and they think that it kind of potentially made them shut down and hide their emotions in. I think there's ways to kind of misuse the philosophical concepts if one is not, implementing them in a way from where they're not in a place of crisis. Stoicism would not be something that I would be going and reading when I'm in a place of crisis, right? This would be something that I would do when I was a bit further in my recovery journey, right? Because when I first started, I needed those DBT pages. I needed my DBT therapist. I needed that. But I do believe that once you get to a certain point in your recovery, you start to go, what else? What other tools can I start using? It's like someone that's in crisis, meditation may not be the best thing for them, right? Like some people can be very deeply triggered and re-traumatized if they were to try to jump into these things. And this is why it's so important to know what works for you. Know when you're in crisis versus when you're ready to start, where you might be starting to feel, I started to feel in my recovery like, okay, I know all the skills, I know all the acronyms. Why do I still feel so empty? Why do I still feel like there's no purpose? There must just be something wrong with me, right? Because I did all the things they say that I should do, and I'm still feeling like I have no purpose in my life, right? That's when I had to start going outside and widening my sphere and start, looking into philosophy and metaphysics and all of these things. And it allowed me to kind of start really widening my mind, getting better at critical thinking. And now I have an easier time being in the world because I don't have such serious main character syndrome anymore. But that required me to expand out of that, what I call the BPD basics, right? But we all need them. There is a place for them. And it's so incredibly important because you have to be able to get yourself out of crisis and feel okay and safe in your body and all these things before you can expand outside.
Yeah. And that is, I think even in the DBT manual, it says something along the lines of DBT is not enough, but it is often a necessary first step.
Yes.
Because without the DBT skills, however you get them, right? If you get them via DBT therapy, or you learned your mindfulness and yoga and your emotion regulation and your distress tolerance from your faith and your interpersonal skills from practice and accepting feedback, right? Because you can hit all the modules that way too. And my brain just completely skipped a beat. I'm so sorry.
It's totally fine.
But all of those skills allow you to do is participate fully in building the life that you want. You don't have that life at the completion of the skills. The skills allow you to build it. And that can be for very valid reasons, that can be incredibly frustrating. Like you expressed, like I did all this effing work and like I'm still empty inside, but I'm just not bothering anybody else with my behavior. Whereas my prize, this feels like garbage. I hate this. Like, and that's a very, very valid criticism of DBT, because that's true. The skills give you the ability to participate more fully in life, but the building of the life is still something that you will have to do in the 6 days and 23 hours outside of therapy, even if you have therapy. So
I see someone say a couple of things I really want to like acknowledge, because Brian just said, this is a lot of info. I'm just starting DBT. I feel like I have a long way to go. You know what? Give yourself grace. That's what I say to anyone. If you haven't heard of any of these concepts, everyone I really believe has their own path. And for me, recovery was like following the breadcrumbs. For some people, that might be like DBT, then yoga, then, converting to Islam. You know what I mean? Then for some other person, it might be therapy, then stoicism, then writing a book on stoicism, right? There are so many different pathways. And what I recommend is find what works for you. Learn how to listen to your body, start like following the breadcrumbs of what you think will work, what gives you, and try everything so that you can really know and experiment and realize that there's no finish line to any of this. It's a eternal unfolding of your recovery journey. It's so easy to start saying like, how long until I'm fixed? How long until I'm cured or better? And that's just not the way. And someone commented, and I relate so much to this, and then I'll hand things over to Catherine, but someone named Emily, I'm trying to scroll up because every time someone comments, it takes me back down. So I apologize, everyone. So I'm just going to copy and paste this over to myself. She says, I noticed that BPD can turn into NPD, which is narcissistic personality disorder, if you study enough leveling up skills. Is that good or bad? And I just want to say, for me, the thing that hindered me most in getting to the place that I am now was like hyper analyzing, like, oh, do I now have this disorder? Am I this, right? Like, just let yourself be, I would say, those kind of questions. Can I turn into a narcissist? I don't know if that's offering you very much, just give yourself grace, find out the stuff that's keeping you stuck, and try your best to work on it, and keep experimenting with different tools and research things and go down the rabbit hole of researching to find what works for you, and release the over analyzing of things. And I think, to take it back to social media, social media can sometimes make us go into this like analyzing mode that isn't helpful.
Yeah, I do think that can be, a drawback. I think there's a tendency to, like, you see something and it looks like it could be a fit, and then, oh no, is that what I am? But like Molly said, I mean, when we talk about moving through recovery, and to those of you who commented that you're kind of at the beginning of your journey and that it's really overwhelming and scary, and it is very overwhelming and scary, and the journey is long. I would be completely lying if I didn't say the journey is long. But what I tell people is a little better is still better.
Yeah.
Right. So this is not a real client I'm using. This is an example of a person's journey that they could take. Right. If someone is at the point when they're untreated, undiagnosed, where they're suicidal almost every day, any type of interpersonal difficulty makes them self-harm, they're having panic attacks, like, if they get to a point where they're suicidal once a week, I wouldn't consider that done. I wouldn't say, okay, check, you're good, you reduced your suicidality by 80% or whatever. I wouldn't say that. But I would say it's easier to live life when you're suicidal once a week than when you're suicidal every day. And when it's once a week, you have a little bit more breathing room in your life to start building that life outside of BPD. And then you get a little bit better and you have a little more space. And really, it's hard when you worked really hard, you got a little bit better and things are still hard. So I want to honor that. And I want to offer some encouragement that if you really reframe it and look at what it has been, progress is progress, and the hard work really does make a difference. So I see Jillian. I think that's my hint that it's time for Q&A. So I will.
Sure is. This has been incredible. Just watching you guys go back and forth. I love how sort of informal it's been and so authentic. This was wonderful. And the chat's been blowing up. Just exciting. Just so exciting. And the Q&A. So I've got some good stuff in here. Let's see. Okay, so how do you both navigate finding culturally informed approaches to sharing BPD content? As a person of color, I always have to translate it back to my personal cultural experiences. So just curious.
I think that that's a very valid question. And I'll be honest, there is not a tremendous amount of research on that. So that is definitely an area that needs improvement on a personal level and in the field. It is especially some of the like interpersonal skills do not translate. They don't even translate from women to men very well. Like one of the interpersonal skills talks about being assertive, looking somebody directly in the eye, you know, like not stammering, not apologizing. Well, if I'm working with a man who's 6'5", telling him to look somebody directly in the eye and not apologize and speak firmly, he's going to go scare people. And that's not fair to put him in that situation by telling him to practice that skill. So that is absolutely something that needs work. And what I try to do is on an individual level, when I'm working directly with somebody, I try to tailor that skill to them. So I'll kind of say like, this is the manual. I'm not sure how that fits for you. If I know something about the client, I might say, hey, this particular piece might not fit for you. I'll kind of ask them. And then we say, okay, how can we make this applicable in your world? So in terms of one-on-one, that's kind of how I do it. In terms of sharing on Instagram, I will be honest, that is a needs improvement for me.
Nice. When it comes to my response to this, you know, with my listeners, I'm blessed to be able to speak to my listeners in like a really long form way. And what's really cool is I'm just a voice on my podcast. And the reason why I don't do a lot of video content is because I feel like that just brings us back to a really human place with one another. But when it comes to my listeners, I'm very open about how aware I am of, for example, like the privilege that I've experienced because of my personal presentation and my background. But I love the fact that I have such a diverse listenership and I receive voicemails and play these experiences of people from all across the world, all across the gender spectrum, all across the sexuality spectrum, and being able to platform other voices has been such an honor for me on my podcast. And in addition to that, the reason why I've pivoted to an approach of drawing more from depth psychology and mysticism and myth is because it takes a lot of these archetypal feelings and these universal experiences that we go through as human beings and allows me to come from that place. And so that's kind of the way that I've approached that in my own work.
Great, thank you. Another question. Thoughts about when a diagnosis is helpful versus harmful?
I think that is very case by case. So in my experience, most folks, when they find out about BPD and what it is, most folks' reaction is kind of similar to what you shared, Jillian, like, oh, there's a name for it. Because a lot of times when people are living with BPD, their lived experience is they're trying their best. It's going catastrophically wrong all the time. The people around them are saying, there's nothing wrong with you. You just need to try harder. And you're bad for not wanting to try harder. That's kind of the message that people get when they're symptomatic. So when they find out, oh, it's not depression, it's not anxiety, there's an actual name, like people have this, I'm not alone, there's a name, there's a pattern, there's a treatment. I think it can be such a relief. It can be so validating. People can feel so seen and heard. I do believe in dialectics. Two things can be true at the same time. A diagnosis can be harmful. Sometimes people might use it as a sword and shield. So if they are really symptomatic and the way that they're acting out is impacting other people, they might say, that's not my fault, I have BPD. And the truth is, you're still responsible for your behavior, regardless of your diagnosis, right? If I have if somebody has a diagnosis of schizophrenia and then they truly don't understand what's going on and they hurt somebody else, they're still responsible. We change how we hold them responsible, but they're still responsible. So in my experience, that can be a downside of a diagnosis, or sometimes professionals will kind of diagnose and run. Like they'll be like, oh, we did our assessment, you have BPD, I don't treat that, bye. And I think that can be kind of harmful as well, because then you're leaving people on their own to type it into the Google machine and hope that they can be selective about what they're reading, which of course is very, very difficult to do when you're in the midst of whatever emotional turmoil you're in, that you're getting diagnosed.
I mean, beautifully put by Catherine. I share many of the same sentiments of the really powerful sense of community and validation that can come with finally being like, I finally have language to describe something that I'm going through. And I think that's powerful. And for me, the content on BPD was that first breadcrumb for me. And that's what I mean is like, I love the idea of thinking of our recovery as a never ending, just like following the next breadcrumb and never finishing. It's just like getting better and growing, and everybody has their own paths of breadcrumbs to follow. There's a quote from philosophy. You can tell that I'm always going back to that. But it's, never confuse the map for the territory. And I bring this up a lot on the podcast. And I think that, for me, and again, I always reiterate this to my listeners. So if any of them are here, they'll know I say over and over, this is my opinion, my personal thing, and yours could be totally different. That's the beauty of all of this. That's the beauty of groups like this. But for me, I found that the harmful nature of the label is like Catherine said, I believe in I love Jungian depth psychology, and there's a shadow side to everything, right? There can be good and bad. It's that dialectical thinking. And for me, the good of the label was a lot of what Catherine shared. And then maybe the other side of that, not necessarily even bad, it's just where it could start to become a stumbling block in my recovery was when I started identifying with it too much, right? When it became the central feature of my recovery. Just why I don't believe my sexuality is who I am, my gender, my race, my psychiatric labels. It's about something else. And I wanted to find out who I truly was underneath all of that stuff that was keeping me stuck. And I perceived that those traits were actually part of what was keeping me stuck. So I wanted to shed all of it. But finding out about it and connecting with some of these people, like for example, Catherine has become a really good friend of mine. Melanie's become an amazing friend of mine amongst many other people I've met through this community. So it's been a really important breadcrumb. And I still find so much help and support and community in it. But I'm also trying to expand past it as well at the same time.
Great. Thank you for that. I can see we have 1:30, and I actually don't know if it will cut us off right at that mark. But I have a really good question. So maybe if you've got just a couple words about it. What do you think will help break the stigma of BPD?
Information. One word.
Wow, I'm impressed. Go ahead.
All of the research that we have, all of the new research points to good outcomes. Not easy, not short, but good outcomes. And I personally think 3/4 of the stigma is because there are uninformed therapists out there who are parroting what their supervisor told them, who their supervisor told them, 10 generations of supervisors. The more information we can get out to therapists and people with BPD that outcomes are good, the less stigma there will be.
Yeah.
Molly, what about you?
I'll keep it short too. Trauma-informed care, and also the depathologization of the human experience. Not everything we experience is a disorder or dysfunction. It's just moving through the natural human process, and part of that is suffering. And so that's how I feel.
Great. I think that's a great closing. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Catherine and Molly, for this amazing opening plenary. I look forward to seeing folks in other sessions for the remainder of the day. Enjoy your
Thank you so
time at
much for having
BPDFest,
us.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.